Alrighty, well, thank you for taking time out of your evening to join us tonight. Really appreciate the amount of interest in this session. It's really great to see you all here, and I've already received some great questions, which we'll put to Casey a bit later on tonight. So yes, if you missed the intro, my name is Mel. I'm the new president of IABC Queensland, and joining us tonight is Casey McMurtrie, our guest speaker for the evening. And I've seen her presentation before, and it's an excellent presentation. You're going to learn so much tonight. And please ask questions. Now's the opportunity. Nothing is off the table, because this is the time to ask those questions, and it is a safe space, absolutely a safe space. Before we get into getting to know Casey a bit more, we're going to get to know each other a bit more. So just a 5-minute little breakout session where we're going to ask ourselves a couple of questions each in your groups. The first one is, whose country are you from, and what do you know about the traditional custodians? So hopefully you know a little bit about where you're on, what land you're on tonight, or at least where you're from as well. The land that you're on might not be the land that you're from originally. And what is one thing you would like to learn tonight? And keep that in mind for when we get to the Q&A as well. If Casey hasn't covered that particular thing for you in her presentation, great question to ask as we get there. So we're going to break up into your breakout rooms now, just 5 minutes. Nothing too strenuous, I hope, and only small groups. And really, this is an opportunity to add to your LinkedIn group already. So find some new networking, new people to add to your network tonight. I'm going to create the rooms now and send you on your way, and I'll pop those questions into the chat as well. Off you go. Welcome back, everybody. As we're coming back, I'd love it if you could pop in the chat what you talked about in terms of what's one thing you want to learn from tonight. So we've got a bit of an idea of what it is you're after tonight. So just pop that in the chat. And also anything you discovered about the traditional custodians of the land that you're from. As you're doing that, I will officially get proceedings underway. So before we get too far ahead, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm on tonight, Meanjin, which is the Yagara and Turrbal people, and Meanjin being the traditional name for Brisbane. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and of course to those First Nations people joining us tonight. Thank you so much. So let me introduce Casey while you're typing in the chat there. Delighted to introduce Casey. If you haven't followed her on social media, please hop over to Instagram and check out Kaya Djook, and I'm sure you'll see more information about that at the end of her presentation. But she is a very proud Noongar woman and is very generous with her knowledge and what she's about to share tonight. Casey is a consultant. She works with predominantly parents or other adults who want to learn more about how they can bring traditional and First Nations culture into everyday lives. And she's done a lot of work, particularly with early childhood providers in recent times around that. So, Casey, over to you. I will let you take the reins and share your screen. In the meantime, as we said, from your breakout rooms just before, if you could pop into the chat what the one thing is you want to learn tonight, so that we've got an idea of some of the questions we can try and answer throughout the presentation. And the presentation is being recorded, of course. Over to you, Case.
All right, bear with me, 2 years of IT and virtual, and I still need a couple of moments to sort my stuff out. So I appreciate everyone's patience. So I'm assuming you can see that first slide. Yeah, sweet as. Okay, cool. So hi, super excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and keen to jam pack as much hopefully useful knowledge and perspectives in the short time frame. But I can't cover everything. I hope that I can give you some ideas and strategies for you guys to go back to your own organizations and potentially figure out what might need to happen, you know, further in your future. So before I would like to kick off, appreciate Mel's acknowledgement, but as is protocol, as this is not my country, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I live, the land that my children are born, the land that I call a home and has a special place, and that is on Yagara country. And I would like to pay my utmost respect to the elders and ancestors before us, whose shoulders I stand on, and I would not be here without their effort and sacrifice, acknowledge the leaders that are currently leading our community, and acknowledge the leaders that will lead us and guide us into the future. And that little spot there, just, I love that photo of my kids. That's out in Quandamooka country. That's at Coochie Mudlow. It's not very far. And if anyone gets a chance there, it's an absolutely stunning spot. So yeah, just a little bit, Mel, sorry for giving me that blurb. That makes me sound super, super amazing. But essentially, I'm a mum who made a conscious effort to start learning language to teach my children, which comes with its own set of challenges, but also amazing feelings. But as part of that, I wanted to be in a space where I can support adults and parents to support their children in how to really be open and being pretty much being less racist. I'm just going to call it as what it is. How parents and how educators can do that in an everyday life. So just some caveats, some things I just want to be upfront about is I don't speak for all First Nations people. What you'll hear tonight is a combination of my own experiences and my own perspectives. I'll also share some information from other, First Nations organizations and other influencers. But much like within even this small group, we would have varying opinions. It's very much the same for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I'm an expert on what I see, feel, and do, and that is what I'm willing to share with you guys today. Whether you're here as an employee or otherwise, that this is just a step in your own journey of what it might be to be an ally to First Nations people. Unfortunately, you don't get like a black tick today because you've come here. It's an ongoing journey and an ongoing process, and what you learn today and how it can be used is up to you and what work you're willing to do. So I want to put that out there. It is a safe space to learn and ask questions. Honestly, I'd rather you ask now in this environment than walk up to a random Aboriginal person and ask them. May not end well for you. And most things, I'm open. If you are asking a question in the spirit of genuine learning, I will give you my response in a spirit of that genuine learning as well. The information provided, again, it's a step in your own cultural competency, whether that's personally or professionally. And most of the information presented is under the assumption that you may not have knowledge. So if you already know some of the stuff, that's really great. I think it gives you an opportunity to reflect and stop. If you don't, then that's really great too, because it gives you an opportunity to learn. And just to really ground myself here, because I do really want to do right by everyone because you've given your time. What we're really here for is to take a moment to understand the power of words and language, and in particular, how organizations and individuals, the way in which people communicate and engage can have an impact on First Nations people. And whether or not you mean to have a negative impact or not, doesn't take away from the fact that there is an impact, regardless of intent. So I really am honoured to be able to be this space where we get to listen, learn, and reflect together. This lady down the bottom is an amazing advocate for people of colour. If you're on Instagram, please follow her. This is not my work. But these are just some really simple things. They're not simple, they're complex, but a really good visual of things that will stop you in your learning. And the things that will stop you or halt your ability to really take away the information and make really good use of it is the concept of fragility, and in particular white fragility. And I just want to ask if you've ever worked with someone with ego and how you've had to massage that ego and had to work around that ego to get what you want. Think of white fragility as an ego. It's an inability to really reflect upon your own what am I trying to say? It's an inability to really just be humble and reflect upon what you're being learnt and taught. The other concepts are color blindness. So the concept of people saying, I don't see color. I treat people all equal. What that actually tells people and what that tells me is that you don't believe in the differences of life experiences based on the color of my skin and my culture, and you minimize that. Denial is just the simple denial of like denying color, denying cultural identity, denying people of color's experiences. And in the end, concepts such as color blindness and denial only really benefit people who are not of color. And the other thing that is, I want to make an opportunity to point out is, and depending on your organization, what your purpose is, what your frame is, the silence around including cultural perspectives, either in schools or truth-telling or general public silence around really pertinent issues is deafening. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community hear that. And if you are in an organization that's in a position to uplift First Nations voices and First Nations perspectives, that is being an ally. I'm having issues now. No, there I am. So Mel was saying you guys are all in the communication biz. And I want to really let you in on something that you may not have considered before. And I really hope that it helps you understand why respectful and appropriate language is so important for First Nations people. So due to a lot of reasons, personally, collectively, you know, invasion, colonization, the impact of ongoing colonial practices, like due to a myriad of reasons, I'm in a state where I am constantly looking and scanning my environment for signs that a place, a person, an event, an organization is a safe space for me. And what I mean by safe is how not racist is this place or person. And the reason I'm scanning is because I need to actually prepare myself mentally, psychologically, and emotionally to engage in a space. And I need to assess, I'm making an assessment of how authentic I can be and how receptive a person or a place is going to be to my cultural identity, and to any feedback that I may want to give or choose not to give because I don't feel safe enough to do that. Now, this may not be the same for every First Nations person, but I do know that it applies to a lot of people. And so I just want to take the moment and ask everyone and invite everyone to just imagine what it feels like to constantly be scanning for signs of how safe a place or a person is. When I'm going to the shop, when I'm going to a cafe, when I'm going out to dinner, when I'm meeting new people, the constant scanning. And just as you're imagining this, if you can just pop into the chat one word that describes what you feel like that would imagine, what you imagine that feels like. Mel, are you able to just read out?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few words. Exhausting is coming through a lot. Emotionally exhausting, terrifying, on edge, vulnerable and anxious, stressful, fearful, hopeless, alone, an alien in your own land, constantly self-conscious, tiring and anxious has come through a few times.
And it is. And even now, I'm incredibly anxious because I don't know how things are going to be received. And it is exhausting. And I just, if you're in a position and any influence whatsoever to generate visuals or to generate, you know, in your communications that your work, your place, your org or whatever is a safe space, I would implore you to really understand what that takes, and to use your influence in that regard as well. So really simple things are just knowing the difference between a welcome and an acknowledgement of country. For me, this is so innate. This is not my country. I cannot welcome you to this country. So a welcome to country is a protocol where it's done by the traditional custodians that welcome others to their land. An acknowledgement can be done by anyone, and it acknowledges that we are currently standing on Aboriginal, or if you're up in Torres Strait Islander territory, but you are standing on First Nations land. And I think it's really important, again, to really understand the difference, because I've lost count how many times someone has said, I've got to go do a welcome. I'm like, are you a traditional custodian? They're like, no. I'm like, well, you're not doing a welcome, you're doing an acknowledgement. And again, those are those signs and cues that help me assess the cultural safety or cultural capability of an organisation. So I know that can seem quite simple, but it is, again, those signs and cues. If you are doing an acknowledgement, questions of how you do it, you know, the words you can use, the template, the words you can use, you know, can be inspired personally. The thing that I would invite you to think about is that when you do an acknowledgement, you do it with meaning and purpose. You know, you speak as if you're speaking directly to the traditional custodians and their ancestors. And you hold space and respect that protocol as part of any event or meeting. It is its own thing. It's not to be confused or complicated or merged in with some other aspect of a meeting or event. And it's really important to also be mindful that avoiding phrasing or avoiding doing an acknowledgement whilst also recognising the disadvantage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is like a cuddle and a slap in the face at the same time. So if you're working in that kind of field, in that human services field, that meaty stuff you use at the end. You acknowledge and do that acknowledgement on its own. It's its own thing. I've seen it happen and it's not nice. And the impact though of an audience, so if you have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people there, they will notice that. And it will be remembered as well. So I was talking to someone else who was not Australian born, and I love that they are here in Brisbane. And I think I wanted to take this opportunity just to remind everyone that there are two distinct First Nations groups in Australia. And if you've ever had a time where someone spelt your name wrong in an email reply, and your name is literally on your signature, it's, you know, if you've ever had that moment, like, come on, it's just there, it's the same thing. Making sure that your spelling is correct. I've walked into a place before where they spelt the word straight as in arrow. And that immediately told me one of three things. One, which could be forgiven, is either the person who created the sign, English isn't their first language, except it was in a public foyer sitting next to an Australian-born English-speaking person. The second thing it could have told me is that they haven't even started their own cultural capability journey. The third thing it told me was that they were lazy, and I'm going to call it. And in this circumstance, I'm going to highlight it as lazy because the sign was used to promote the organisation's activities for NAIDOC Week. So yeah, just being really mindful that you're using the correct and accurate words. Okay, so let's start with the basics. The way that non-Indigenous people refer and talk about First Nations people is incredibly important. Your words have meaning, regardless of the intent. It has meaning and it has impact. And in my opinion, the old saying, sticks and stones, is just another form of gaslighting. using language that's outdated, offensive, ignorant, racist is damaging. And depending on the organization or the field that you work with, using that type of negative language has a real actual impact directly on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There's studies that have proven that children who experience racism are more likely to experience chronic stress, which leads to developing markers of chronic disease. So there's a real impact physically on people's experiences with racism. So the most appropriate way of referring to First Nations people is to use language that is strengths-based and respectful. So the following is just some words that you'll need to have a good understanding to help with your practice and engagement. So herein lies the tricky part. There will be other perspectives that might not agree with this. You'll notice I haven't used the word Indigenous. And it's not because I think it's disrespectful, but it's because I think it's generic. It's a word that can be applied to all First Nations peoples of any colonized country. So I don't love it. I don't hate it. I don't love it. But the words that you can see up there, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, recognizing that it's two distinct groups that lived on this continent before colonization. First Nations, your language and clan group. So I'm a Noongar woman and my family has connections to Wilman country. So if you do have that knowledge and able to introduce people and you have their permission to introduce, that is a respectful way of doing that. Understanding that elders are highly respected Aboriginal people and held in high esteem by their community, I will automatically refer to someone as auntie and uncle. That's part of my cultural protocol. I have that, and if I don't, I've been roused at. But the trick for non-Indigenous people is to probably check first whether or not that elder is okay with you calling them an auntie or elder. It can just set the tone, and it's about giving mob the ability to determine how they want to be referred to. So always checking in. So First Nations can be more inclusive of the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the term their traditional custodians expresses that the First Nations people don't own the land owns us. I personally prefer traditional custodians, but I recognize that others may prefer traditional owners. You would have heard me just use the term mob there. It's a colloquial term that I use, you know, I'm Noongar mob, or if I connect with other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you know, they might be Murray mob. It is terminology that we use innately. It is probably, I think if anyone has any questions on whether or not they can use the term mob, I think I would probably ask you to reflect upon why you would want to use it, because there is this movement of mob Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people recognizing that there's language innate to our culture, and that we don't want, Mel, I'm stuck on the word when someone comes and takes something off you.
Appropriates.
Thank you. And there is this movement about, well, this is our language that we use and has a cultural significance, and just being really mindful that as an organization or as an individual, you don't want to put yourself in a position where you are perceived to or are culturally appropriating other language terms.
So Casey, in that instance, is it better to use the word community, or is there another terminology that's a better use?
I think it depends on who your audience is. So if it's, you know, a wide-reaching communication something, I would probably stick to community. If you are engaging at an individual level and you have a really good relationship with someone, and, you know, your use of the term mob comes innately, I think that's okay, but it's also by taking leeway of like who the audience is as well.
Fantastic.
Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. And we've had just a couple of other questions, if you don't mind us
Yep.
just popping in there now. One from Meredith here. Is auntie or uncle used for people of a certain age as well, or an expression of their standing or learning?
It's both. So I was taught that anyone who was like my parents' age, I refer to as auntie and uncle. My parents are quite young, so everyone's auntie and uncle. But it is also of standing. And it's also determined by the community as well.
Great. And another question here from Jody, just going back to something you were talking about earlier. What are some of the cues you look for in deciding whether or not this may or may not be a safe space? I would love to understand this more.
So it's really little things. I've been to places where they've been hanging up they've got like a picture of the Aboriginal flag, but it's upside down. So it's those visual cues. It's also, I'm reminded of how much an organization might, and I hope I explained this better, how much an organization might promote Australia Day. And how much they engage in that conversation and how they engage in that conversation. And if it's from a predominantly Western white person's perspective, that gives me visual cues as well. And there's just some examples. I recently went to my boys' OSH, and unbeknownst to me, they had done a lot of work with trying to figure out their own acknowledgement. And I could see that they had done a lot of work, and I could see that it was genuine. It was like an individual approach. And for me, that was the biggest cue that this was a safe place. And yeah, so does that answer? I hope that answers some of the, yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to ask one question with the use of the term mob there that you had before.
Mhm.
How do you feel when, if like I come from Brisbane City Council, and one of the things we're trying to do, or we've created, is communities of inclusion in our organisation, and
Yeah.
one of our communities, they've named themselves, they've labelled themselves, or named themselves One Mob.
Yeah.
So they're actually leading the socialisation of the term mob. So in that instance, is it okay if they're actually putting it out there and
if they're
socializing the term?
Yeah, if they're determining it, if they've made the decision, they are deciding that this is what they want to do, and it's Aboriginal people deciding for themselves. Yeah, of course.
So does that then make it a little bit more acceptable in that wider acceptance of others using the term mob? I totally get, people taking that away from them from its traditional use, but because it's getting that broader acknowledgement, I can see how people might misinterpret and say, oh, okay, it's just common here in this place that we, say mob everywhere.
I'm trying to think, because I think, again, prefacing, I'll give you what I think, and other people will give you different things. If I'm trying to say it like really nicely, but I think I'm just going to say it straight out. If I feel like someone, if I can sense someone is just, it's not natural to them, it's not innate to them, they don't recognize the importance of it, I will sense that in someone, and that will give me a cue that no, you don't have a right to say that. You haven't. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Oh no, well, I totally get your anxiety and that sense of, hang on, you don't have that, but I'm like, how do I balance that, or how do we balance it with people who they're being exposed, who aren't, Indigenous, who are being exposed through that broader communication by those organisations or by those people, putting the term out there, saying mob, we call us One Mob, we're One Mob, and they're in our Indigenous, employees. Yeah. They're just socialising the term. So I'm just trying to find that.
And I think it's the way in which, and I think it's the way in which you communicate. So if you're initially communicating and I don't know, without knowing the ins and outs, if it's a new aspect or a new project and you want to start communicating about it, I think in your communication, it's about potentially going, hey, this is how the name came about. Yeah. And so this is why we've come with this name. And we've been informed by this our own, whatever it is, internal reference group or whatever that is. But it's about being transparent about where the name came from.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yeah. But
Yeah.
but it's more about if they're leading the conversation, definitely
Yeah.
it's a little bit more sort of accepting and open, rather than if, say, as a white
Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon just suddenly used it and said, "Oh, we're going to call you
Yeah,
guys one
and
mob."
that's the thing, and it's about who's leading the conversation, who's making the decision. Again, giving the opportunity if you're in a position of power and influence, are you really, and not you, just you individually,
Yeah,
are you in the right position to be talking about it, or do you need to step aside and give a First Nations person the opportunity? So I think they are the things to consider as well.
Yeah, terrific.
Is it a case, Casey, that group almost has to give permission to others in the organisation to be able to start using that term more frequently in conversation, as opposed to?
Well, I think it'll also be making sure to what extent does that group have input in a communication strategy? To what extent are they being consulted in the way in which to communicate? So whilst they might have come up with the term, there's that which is great, then it's like, well, where else do we need to make sure we're actively and genuinely consulting, so that, again, mob are making decisions that impact on mob. Yeah.
Cool. All right, we'll move on. Thanks, Cam. Great question.
Thank you. Sorry, this is just a bit about just the term peoples in terms of relation to First Nation peoples. And it's just recognizing that there are just multiple countries that existed before colonization, and it's confirmed in the United Nations Declaration Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. So while there are some nuances in preferred terms, there are, I'm going to call it, some depth things that just don't say. It's outdated, it's offensive, it's racist, or it's all three. And they are the term natives and Aborigine, and both of those terms are perceived as insensitive because of the racist connotations from Australia's colonial past, and it lumps our people who have diverse backgrounds into one group. There's a term there called blood quantum. Does anyone want to have a crack at what that means?
I don't want to say it, but that's where you say quarter blood, half blood.
Yeah, thank you for saying it though, like not saying, but answering my question. These are terms that are incredibly offensive. They are part of terminology that was used to justify stolen generation. And they are terms that are also associated with like breeding horses. So anything that is a descriptor of half cut, quarter, 16th is not okay ever. And then any other descriptors such as real, part, or traditional, or urban, they tend to be Western Western concepts of what is considered a stereotype of an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. So really any language that is also othering language, such as they or them, is also not inclusive and it's not strength-based.
Hey, Casey, just a couple of questions. So you've got a bunch of comms people here and we typically don't shut up, so you are going to get a lot of questions. Jacinta has asked a question. May I ask why traditional is offensive, the word of traditional?
So I've had someone, can I tell a story?
Tell a story.
Tell a story. I used to work for a legal firm, and predominantly their clients were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and the lawyer that I worked very closely with was a little pocket rocket of a lawyer. You wanted that person in your back pocket if you ever was in trouble. But one day she was talking about something in relation to mob. And she's like, oh, you know, like those real traditional people? Like what do you mean like that? You know, like the real proper, like the real black fellas, like the real traditional black fellas. I'm like, what? And like the ones that live like, you know, in the desert, the real traditional proper ones. Like, okay. And so I had to talk to her about that. And I'm going to tell you what I heard. I heard that as an urban person who does not live on their traditional lands, I heard I was not a real black fella. That's not potentially what she meant. She was trying to use a descriptor, but that's what I heard, is that the use of those ways in which describing a traditional black person or a traditional Aboriginal person. Now, if you're talking about someone who is still actively practicing cultural traditions, that I think that there's a difference in that description.
And I think it's that nuance, it's just coming through in the chat here as well, in terms of the term traditional owners as opposed to, yes. And there was another question here, just a step from Michaela, just a step further on the discussion of use of the word mob. Would you say this also extends to other words like deadly? Oh, yeah, there we go.
If mob are having a decision in it, and if it's a clear rationale on certain terminology and use of communication, and if you're clearly targeting a particular audience, and you've clearly consulted, I think it's not necessarily what you do or what you're saying, it's how you've come to the decision of it. So I totally understand if there's an Aboriginal medical service that's using the words deadly, totally get that. If it's a one-time predominantly white organization that hasn't consulted, that hasn't targeted, that hasn't been well informed, then that's almost tokenistic. I hope that answers the question.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Cool. So real quick, don't. Casey is an Aborigine, Casey is Native, Casey's children are half caste, Casey's an urban Aboriginal. Please don't. Casey is an Aboriginal person, Casey is a First Nations person, Casey is a Noongar woman. Casey's ancestors have lived on this continent for thousands of years. And then just other things to also just be mindful of, and this is my perspective, and there is different perspectives on it. You know, terminology such as Australia was discovered. I have been consciously trying to avoid using our, and especially when I was working in a statutory organisation, our denounced a sense of ownership. So I think it's just really careful and being mindful. You know, I can see how our could be used as trying to be inclusive, but it could also be misconstrued as like a sense of ownership. And also just Australia Day, there are different perspectives, especially like even in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Personally, that is not a day that brings me joy in any sense of the imagination. I will avoid being in public on that day. And part of the cues and signs of, you know, how much do I need to prepare myself in relation to that day will also be, you know, social media posts, communications, advertisements, like anything that kind of presents a whitewashing approach to the significance and the impact that that day has had on First Nations people. So when thinking about this section and how language you can use to help create a safe space, I move between whether or not this is about clients or the community or employees. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt that it was more relevant to talk about the impact of language and communications internal to an organization. And this next bit is about experiences, you know, as a First Nations employee. And the reason I've taken this approach, that if you are part of an organization that wants to engage with Mob better, or host community events, or really do anything in communications external to your org, you really have to make sure your stuff internal is sorted right. And what do I mean by that? That your organizational communication approach needs to match your organizational cultural capability. There is no point spending time planning for the most beautiful garden if the soil is not conducive to growth. Your attempt to create an inclusive and strength-based communication plan, event, engagement, whatever it is, can all be undone by one individual's lack of cultural capability. And I'll give you a story. I haven't been paying attention to time now, so make sure you, yeah.
Got 10 minutes.
Okay. I once asked a non-Indigenous woman to reflect on their own cultural capability. And this person worked in a statutory body where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were significantly overrepresented, not in a good way, in a very, very bad way. I know that there had been many communications, internal and external, about the way in which said organisation respects, values and recognises of the importance of working in a culturally appropriate way. I asked that person on a scale of 1 to 10 where they considered themselves and their own cultural capability. 1 being not great, 10 being amazing. Her response was a 10. And I was like, floored. I'm like, wow, why would I even give myself a 10? When I asked her what she does, that she would consider herself a 10, meaning no room for improvement. Her response was nothing really, I just really treat everyone the same. And so despite all of the organizational communication, that one person's response told me something completely different. And I really just wanted to highlight that whatever amazing communications track, comms, consultation, engagement that you do, if overall the organization's cultural capability doesn't match that, it's at odds, and it will have an impact. So the other thing I really want to take the opportunity to share and highlight is to really avoid the deficient discourse. So historically, overwhelmingly, communications and discussions regarding First Nations people has been done and authored by non-Indigenous peoples, and tends to represent First Nations people in a negative light. And if we just think about powerful media mongols, if we think about the way in which sometimes newspapers present issues experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait people as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander problems. So it's really important that any discussions regarding Indigenous people is done in a way that is positive, done in a way that is strength-based, done in a way that separates the problem from the people, and even better, done in a way where if you are in a position to give voice again to other First Nations people, that you leverage your power to give that voice to them. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and this is a quote by Arnie Lilla Watson, "If you've come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together." So Auntie there is, I don't know her personally, but I love this quote. She is a visual artist, activist, educator, born in 1940s, grew up on the River Dawson, became the first Aboriginal person appointed as a tutor by UQ. And the reason I included her quote is because I think it demonstrates my next point about the term empower. So empowerment means to give someone power or authority, particularly with regard to control of their own life. However, in some contexts, the word empowerment can actually be disempowering if it's understood to mean that the giving of the power by the powerful to the powerless. So when we understand this, the word empowerment actually only reinforces power inequalities. So the way that I've been guilty of this, we really want to empower people, and especially working in particular organizations, but only the type of power that we want to give people. So we're going to give you empowerment, but only within this box. So I think it's just really careful and just really mindful of when you're using that terminology. Other phrases that you could use is like walk alongside or walk together. So steps to creating a safe space. There is really so much out there. And I think the thing that will serve you well is to do your research first, before asking someone else to educate you, and to really demonstrate that you're being proactive to educate yourself. Reach out to First Nation staff and ask them how much involvement they'd like, to be able to influence either language or communication with your org. But don't expect or assume that mob want to have an active role. The bulk of the heavy lifting should actually be done by the organisation. And be genuine, transparent, and take action with feedback. Don't BS. Like, honestly, if someone asks you what budget you have available to engage a First Nations artist or elder, and there's some response about collaboration for the mutual benefit of both parties, just say that you've got no money and then go and figure out how to get money. It's the knowledge and expertise, and it's expertise that can only be derived by First Nations people, and that expertise needs to be respected accordingly. You wouldn't ask Mel to come in and do a piece of work for the mutual benefit of both parties. No, Mel shaking her head.
You most certainly would not.
No. So they're just, some steps. I'm just mindful of time because I really want to make sure we've got time for questions as well. So they're my two beautiful kids there, Adam and Jeramba. So you want to also be able to just show effort. So it's going to be hard for organizations to please everyone. There's no rule book, there's no magic guide, much like, and this is a quote that I saw from someone who I follow on Instagram, so it's not mine, but much like there wasn't a quote on a book on how to navigate racism, there's not a standard book on how to navigate this aspect as well. But what will serve you, and what I ask you to think about, is that being able to demonstrate genuine effort to collaborate about terminology, style guides, communication will place you in a better position than not. So it's not always what the end product is, it's being able to demonstrate how you got there, and how you got there using those principles of respect, self-determination. So what if I get it wrong? Even with the best research, even with the best intentions, even with all the double clicking, you are going to get it wrong. I've got it wrong. And I think this really is something that just needs to be named. With all the resources that's out there, there are things that are contested and there are things that are complex. But what's going to serve you well is your reaction and response to rectify will speak more than the initial wrongdoing. So you and your organization's ability to listen with humility, openness, and to learn and move forward to a solution will be more telling than the initial transgression. So avoid or don't dismiss, don't scapegoat, don't minimize, distract, or ignore. Acknowledge it as an opportunity for learn and grow. And I know as comms people, you probably do want that like rule book. It doesn't exist. But I think, if you come with that ability of recognizing that at some point we might get it wrong, and with that ability of like, this is an opportunity to learn and grow, that will serve you well. So these are just some resources that I use and love. The Gambay First Languages is really good. It's interactive website, and you can actually, they've got videos of like some learning some First Nations languages that are, it's a map of Australia. It's amazing. Know Your Country website has some really good resources as well. Indigenous X is 100% Indigenous owned operated media consultancy training organization. So when we talk about being able to give voice and using your or our power and influence, that is an example of like, that is where someone who is an expertise should be given a platform. IABC website, Creative Spirits website, and the Gari Yala website is also just really good and handy resource in terms of understanding First Nations experiences in the workplace as well. Some podcasts that I like to listen to, just thought I share it out there with all the free time that everyone has. That Frontier War Stories, be in a good space for that. That's not a light Sunday morning stroll listening to. It's confronting, but it's truth telling. And if you don't know much about frontier wars, I would highly recommend that you give that podcast a listen to. And the other, you know, where I get my learnings from, and I'm still continuing learning, these are some really great people who I follow on Instagram, and I just wanted to share it. So Common Ground, Deadly Connections. If anyone's seen Incarceration Nation, one of the key Black men in there is associated with this organization. They've got some powerful and amazing things to learn, and the things that they post really challenge and create opportunity to learn as well. Misa is really good. She does really good explaining on, you know, what it might be to culturally appropriate language. So she's really good. And Black Business as well. So that's a Black owned organization to promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses. So I just wanted to share that. Questions. How'd I do with time? How'd I do with time?
Oh, you're spot on. So we do have quite a few questions, and they're good questions as well.
Okay.
So we'll try and get through as many as we can. Any that we're not able to answer tonight, Casey, perhaps you and I can put together some responses and reply to those people individually if we need to. Yeah, cool. Okay, so Jacinta has a question. I have an interview with an elder tomorrow. Is it appropriate for me to ask if she wishes to be referred to as auntie or her first name? I planned on flagging with her that I'm new in this area, so I have a lot of growth to do and knowledge to gain. But will this be construed as not being invested or making excuses?
I can't tell you what her response is, but I have done that. I have gone up and I'm going, I'm new to this place. What do you want me to call you? And I think by you being open and transparent and genuine will serve you well.
Awesome. Next question. What are your thoughts on using the word celebrate when it relates to NAIDOC Week or National Reconciliation Week?
Good question.
Mm.
Personally, I'm cool with NAIDOC Week being celebrated. National Reconciliation Week is a different matter for me. And this is me going to reconcile would indicate a relationship to begin with. And there's a plethora of reasons why I don't think that we had a good relationship to begin with to reconcile. So that's my take. Others may have a different perspective. Yeah.
Could it use language like exploring National Reconciliation Week or recognizing, something along those lines?
Like, I think you can do that, acknowledging, recognizing you do different language. I mean, other people do celebrate it. I think that's the thing, is that, you know, who's your audience? Who's your target? And who have you consulted?
Awesome. Question from Damien here. I work for a health service and regularly have requests from departments or teams wanting to add the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags to resources such as fact sheets. Make them culturally inclusive, they say. I question if it's a tokenistic approach to tick a box. Interested in your thoughts on this.
Is that the only thing that they are doing? I think you probably answered your own question. I think if that's the only thing, by painting something or making something more prettier and black, but if they haven't considered the terminology, if they haven't considered the audience. So like, for example, you know, I used to work for an organization whose clientele had really poor numeracy and literacy, and yet the fact sheets that we had were very comprehensive and very detailed and very wordy, and was not reflective of the audience's need and didn't help their understanding. So by culturally appropriate, it goes more to the visual cues.
Yeah, great. Vanessa's asked, the agency I work in will be welcoming First Nations trainees in the coming months. What could we do to help them feel and know that it is a safe place for them and that they are welcomed?
I'd ask them. I would sit down. I would individually, if they're a group, they may not feel comfortable altogether, but I would find time to go, what do we as an organisation need to do to keep you safe or to respect and honour your culture? And I would take their lead from that, I think, and be really open and give opportunity if there's an opportunity for them to create their own solutions, but it's supported by the organisation. You know, if you're in a position to do that, I think that's what I would do.
Great. And we've probably got time for one more question. Zoe's asked, is it best to not mention Australia Day or to acknowledge why it's not a positive day to be celebrated?
It depends on the context, which I know a lot of my answers like depends on the context. It does depend on it. It is of significance. And I think if you're in a position to present or of an influence to even influence others, so that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people don't have to keep, you know, banging our heads against the wall. You know, if non-Indigenous people are also able to influence as well, that January 26th is not a day that is recognised as a celebration. So I think, yeah, it's the context and who's the audience. But, you know, if I'm reading something or whatever the communication is, then I can see that someone has presented a different viewpoint that isn't whitewashing. I'm going to respect that organisation.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Casey, for your time tonight and being so generous with your knowledge and your experiences and so open and honest about that as well. Thank you also to everybody for your fantastic questions and really engaging in tonight's session. I've popped a link to a feedback survey in the chat there. And if you have any other questions, I know Erin's popped one in there. So Erin, I'll chat to Casey about that offline and get a response back to you. Just shoot them through in the chat now or shoot me an email, and very happy to pass those on to Casey and get back to you. In the meantime, Casey's put her details up on the screen there where you can follow her at Kaya Djook. I'd also just like to bring your attention to our next event, which is coming up in August, and it's PR Darlings. So the PR Darlings, owners of the PR Darlings podcast, are joining us with a couple of other special guests yet to be confirmed, but just wait for that, for a panel. And this one will be a hybrid event. So we'll be in person at the Paddo, we're in our usual space, but also live streaming as well. So more details will come out about that in the next few days. Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Casey, thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.